His name echoed through the most exclusive circles of the corporate world as a symbol of precision, ambition, and elegance. At only 38, Ethan Carter had achieved what many executives spent their entire careers chasing, leading an international holding of luxury products, encompassing renowned brands in fashion, perfumery, hospitality, and design. He oversaw operations in over 20 countries, with branches in cities like Milan, Tokyo, London, and Dubai. His image, always impeccable, was constantly tied to high-end campaigns, gala events, and meetings with heads of state. Few knew, however, that behind that calculating and meticulously controlled figure lay a background very different from the glamorous facade he now embodied. Before becoming an internationally admired businessman, he had grown up in a small town surrounded by snowy mountains and silent forests, where time seemed to flow at its own pace. His return to that small American town, Aspen, Colorado, was not driven by nostalgia, but by strategy. The company had chosen the location to launch a line of eco-friendly products, and he insisted on personally overseeing every step of this new phase in global expansion. His decision to lead the project on-site instead of delegating it surprised his closest team. He wasn't known for directly involving himself in the company's local operations. He preferred to control everything from his headquarters in New York, where decisions were made with cold detachment. But Aspen was no ordinary city. Beyond its growing environmental and touristic significance, it carried memories he had buried under years of intense work and calculated silence. As soon as he arrived, the mountain air and the woody scent of the pines stirred up old sensations he refused to name. It was as if every corner of that place held a fragment of who he had once been, before becoming the relentless man who now ran empires. He settled into a boutique hotel owned by his own holding, overlooking the snow-covered mountains. Nothing in his demeanor hinted that the trip was stirring something personal. Yet as he stared out at the landscape through the wide glass windows, his gaze occasionally lost the sharp focus that usually defined him in business meetings. The local expansion office was elegant and discreet, reflecting the brand's refined aesthetic. His schedule was packed: meetings with community leaders, sessions with environmental organizations, site visits for potential installations, and decisions about the launch event that would officially mark the company's arrival in Aspen. Every detail had been meticulously planned. He personally reviewed the documents, read reports, studied graphs, and familiarized himself with the region's social needs, all with the precision of someone who left nothing to chance. But behind every spreadsheet was a silent, nearly imperceptible expectation he avoided facing. Being there, on the ground he once called home, meant more than just a business project. He knew it, even if he wouldn't admit it, not even to himself. And though he didn't yet fully recognize it, something deep in his soul had already begun to stir, as if the past were waiting for the right moment to resurface, not as vague memories, but as real presences he never imagined he'd encounter again. His name now carried weight. People treated him with reverence. Journalists approached with caution, and local entrepreneurs felt privileged by his presence. But beneath the tailored suit and measured gestures was a man who still bore the marks of a youth abruptly cut short by choices larger than himself. When he left years ago, it was with the conviction that the world could offer him everything his hometown never could. And indeed, the world opened doors, but it also exacted its price. The sacrifice of bonds, affections, and roots was part of the silent pact he made with fate. Now, back at the starting point, he was no longer willing to be led by reason alone. Even without admitting it, he longed to understand if he had left behind something money could never replace. That's why, as he walked once more on Aspen's sidewalks, seeing unfamiliar faces mixed with a few familiar ones, feeling the cold wind on his skin just like before, he couldn't avoid the confusing feeling forming in his chest. The absolute control that had always defined him began to give way to something softer and uncontrollable, the memory of who he had been, and perhaps, who he could still become. Ever since the announcement that the international holding would be coming to town, a new rhythm had quietly begun pulsing through Aspen's community. The anticipation spread among local business owners, volunteers, community leaders, and young entrepreneurs, all alert to the opportunities that the expansion might bring. Olivia Bennett at the center of this movement, she emerged as a figure of balance, respect, and trust. At 36, she was known for her dedication to community projects and for the way she could unite people around collective causes. She had grown up in Aspen, building her life with deep roots and genuine bonds. After completing her studies at Colorado State University, she chose to return to her hometown instead of pursuing a career in larger urban centers, turning down offers that could have expanded her professional path. Her focus had always been on giving back to the community all that she had received during her formative years. That's how she came to lead initiatives focused on environmental preservation, social inclusion, and the strengthening of local identity, earning the respect even of the most skeptical. When she learned that the luxury goods company had selected Aspen as the base for its new sustainable project, she understood the town was on the brink of a major transition. The launch event, designed to introduce the brand's eco-friendly philosophy and build ties with the local population, required flawless organization. She was entrusted with that responsibility, not out of favoritism, but merit. Her experience, community vision, and sensitivity made her the ideal person for the job. By accepting the challenge, she knew she would need to navigate between two very different worlds. On one side, the corporate sphere, with its aesthetic demands and strategic objectives. On the other, the simplicity of the local population, accustomed to more modest but deeply meaningful events. Still, she took on the role with the same approach that had always guided her: firmness, empathy, and commitment. With each meeting, she skillfully coordinated the demands of the holdings team with the expectations of the local residents. She supervised the selection of vendors, carefully chose the event spaces, and proposed activities that highlighted local talent, from musical performances to art exhibitions by regional artists. Nothing escaped her attentive eye. Even when disagreements arose between corporate standards and community proposals, she knew how to mediate decisions with intelligence, finding solutions that preserved the spirit of the town without compromising the company's image. Her name, once known only in circles of volunteer work and environmental education, began to be mentioned among executives and managers with quiet admiration. But to her, it was just another job. She wasn't dazzled by figures, contracts, or praise. What truly mattered was ensuring that the event left a positive legacy, not just fleeting memories. She didn't know, however, that the seemingly technical role she had taken on would bring her face to face with something far more personal than any logistical challenge. While reviewing documents, adjusting deadlines, and organizing schedules, she had no idea that the name behind the holding, the renowned CEO set to oversee the expansion, was the same man who years ago had left a void in her life that was hard to fill, the one who left without looking back, leaving behind vivid memories that time never fully erased. So when she received word that he would be arriving in Aspen for an initial meeting with the local coordinators, her heart hesitated for just a moment. She took a deep breath and chose to move forward as she always had, with professionalism. She was a woman who had built her strength through endured silences, waits that required no return, and choices made with a weathered heart. She didn't want the past to interfere with the present, not while an entire town was counting on her. In the days leading up to the meeting, she focused on the technical details of the event. She drafted speeches, reviewed design proposals, tested equipment, and led rehearsals with the team. Despite the tension that quietly grew within her, she didn't let anyone see a shift in her demeanor. She remained natural, cordial, determined, just as she had always been. Deep down, part of her already sensed that this reunion was inevitable. And even though she couldn't name the unease that grew with every step toward the event, she knew something was about to happen that would shake the foundations of everything she had built. Still, she held firm. The success of the project was vital for the town, and she would not let old emotions interfere with the mission she had taken on so seriously. But fate, patient and precise, was bringing them back together through what seemed like purely professional paths, though they quietly carried the promise of something much deeper and unavoidable. The day of the first official meeting between the holdings team and the local organizers dawned with a clear sky, but the air was heavy with contained tension. He arrived at the company's temporary headquarters with the impeccable punctuality that defined his style, accompanied by 2 direct advisors, and immediately began analyzing reports, social impact goals, and community engagement projections. The numbers were on target, the actions aligned with the company's principles, and the branding returns looked promising. But amid the precision of charts and the technical control of the meetings, there was something about the atmosphere that unsettled him. It wasn't the project itself, nor the business challenge. which had long been part of his routine on far riskier scales. It was a feeling he couldn't name, as if every wall in that modest Aspen building held more than records and spreadsheets. As if the past itself were lurking, ready to reveal itself at the most unexpected moment. And that's exactly what happened. She arrived a few minutes later, dressed in simplicity and confidence, as always. In her hands were folders with updated schedules, revised visuals, and a calm expression that masked a flicker of silent resistance. When their eyes met after so many years, there was no drama, no visible reaction. Just a jolt that spilled into the silence, as loud as a muffled thunderclap. Neither flinched during the formal greeting, but inside, old memories flashed like lightning layered over the present. He immediately recognized the determined look in her eyes, the way she held her posture firm even in the face of uncertainty, and the slight curve of her lips when she had to restrain a stronger emotion. She, in turn, felt the familiar impact of a memory that had never fully faded. He was the same boy who, years earlier, had promised her a shared future, and left before either of them could understand what that would really mean. As teenagers, they had built a bond that defied the usual bounds of their age. They walked together through the woods around Aspen, shared dreams under the stars, and planned a life that felt possible while time was still gentle. But then came the news of the international scholarship. He was offered a chance to study in London, at a prestigious university, with the whole world opening up before him. She supported him with an aching heart, unaware it would be their last summer together. He left without looking back, and over the years, silence became the only bridge between them. No letters, no visits. Just absence, shaping empty spaces that she filled with work, community devotion, and a quiet strength that carried her through the hardest days. He, meanwhile, kept building his empire, traveling through world capitals, surrounded by strategic decisions and luxuries that, deep down, never erased the traces of what he had left behind. His presence in Aspen reopened wounds she thought had already healed. But there were no confrontations, no arguments, only the inevitable coexistence imposed by the project that now bound them. In meetings, they maintained their composure. They spoke about deadlines, supplier quality, and marketing strategies. But behind every word, there was a heavy subtext, a tension no one around them noticed. Yet they both felt it like a taut rope on the verge of snapping. And even when they tried to avoid each other, fate seemed to place them side by side during site visits, urgent decisions, and last-minute adjustments. In silence, they shared the memory of a youth that hadn't grown old, just been left in suspension. The reunion forced them to face who they had become, and what they hadn't had the courage to confront when there was still time. She didn't allow emotion to take over, even when she saw him crossing the same street where, years ago, he had promised to come back for her. She pretended not to notice how he scanned the surroundings, as if looking for fragments of what was left behind. He, on the other hand, didn't show the weight of the guilt he carried, the one he had always tried to bury beneath achievements and obligations. But now, seeing her so close, he realized that none of it had prepared him to face her. She was there, present, strong, even more beautiful than in his memories, and completely different from what he expected. She was no longer the dreamy young woman who had watched him leave the bus station with tearful eyes. She was a whole woman now, built through conscious choices, endured wounds, and a dignity that didn't waver in the face of any reunion. The project itself continued on schedule, but the nights became longer for both of them. Each, in their own way, tried to reorganize feelings that resurfaced like unexpected tides. He relived the moments they shared, the brief touches, the silences heavy with unfulfilled promises. She, on the other hand, tried to stay focused on the event, even though her mind kept drifting back to the summers spent at his side. There was a quiet struggle between the desire to ignore the past and the need to understand why that story was never resolved. And amid Aspen's peaceful setting, now bustling with corporate activity and growing expectations, the two were forced to live with the consequences of what they hadn't said, hadn't explained, and had left behind without even trying to make it right. With the unexpected reunion already established as a silent backdrop, the following days in Aspen gained a faster pace. The town, known for its mountainous landscape and subtle charm, became the stage for unusual activity. Hotels adjusted schedules, Shopkeepers prepared special displays, and residents followed with curiosity the arrival of a team of executives who promised to turn the area into an international showcase for the launch of a new line of sustainable products. It wasn't just another marketing move. The holding, one of the largest in the consumer goods sector, intended to use Aspen as a symbolic reference for its new global strategy, to show that innovation and environmental responsibility could go hand in hand. And to do that, they chose not a bustling capital, but a town that embodied values of community, connection to nature, and authenticity, exactly what Aspen had to offer. The presence of the executives, led by him, energized all levels of local life. The streets became livelier, the number of visitors increased, and even the city hall got involved in the logistics, signaling the importance of the moment. He, at the forefront of negotiations, kept his controlled demeanor, but internally was dealing with a mix of corporate tension and emotional remnants that kept surfacing at the most inconvenient times. Since the reunion with her, his days had lost the predictability he had always prized. Each meeting became a small battle between what needed to be done and what could no longer be ignored. Even so, he never lost focus on the mission that had brought him there. He coordinated teams, reviewed presentations, validated schedules, and ensured that every stage of the campaign was perfectly aligned with the sustainability principles promoted by the new product line. The proposal involved not only the sale of eco-friendly items, but the creation of a new brand positioning. The company wanted to associate its image with values like environmental awareness, clean production, and responsible consumption. To that end, they partnered with local suppliers, invested in biodegradable packaging, and launched initiatives that integrated Aspen's community into the process. She, as the local lead for the event, was in charge of coordinating with regional leaders, ensuring every detail respected the town's character and needs. Although they avoided direct contact beyond what was necessary, their paths continued to cross frequently, and with each new meeting, no matter how formal, the tension between the unresolved past and the professional present quietly intensified. The rehearsals for the launch ceremony began to take shape, with structures set up in the town square, interactive panels on conscious consumption, and exhibits highlighting the region's natural beauty. Young people from the community were invited to participate as volunteers, while local artists created installations inspired by environmental preservation. It was an ambitious project, combining technological innovation with human sensitivity in every detail. And even though the public embraced the proposal with enthusiasm, behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. The schedule was tight. Any unexpected setback could jeopardize the launch's visibility, and the eyes of the international media were already on Aspen. But despite all the demands, there was a strange feeling in the air, as if all of it, no matter how well planned, carried something inevitable, as if the real impact of the campaign went beyond the numbers and goals listed in the reports. For her, the days that followed were a constant negotiation between focus and restraint. She managed the local team, oversaw task execution, handled last-minute demands, and at the same time, avoided any emotional slip that could weaken her stance in front of him. But the effort took its toll. At night, when she finally allowed herself to slow down, she felt the weight of the forced coexistence and the past that seemed to resurface in every detail of the present. The light scent of wildflowers, the sounds from the surrounding forests, the coffees shared with volunteers. Everything reminded her of the time when she believed the two of them had a future together. And even while trying to keep her mind busy with the demands of the event, his presence unsettled her in a way no professional challenge ever had. It was as if her story was being rewritten, without her permission. For him, Aspen now represented more than a well-structured campaign. The town that had once been the backdrop for his teenage dreams now confronted him with the consequences of his decisions. Every street, every trail, every familiar face awakened fragments of long-dormant memories. Even surrounded by his trusted team, he felt vulnerable in a way he hadn't in years. There was something about that land that didn't allow for masks. And as he watched her commitment to the project, her tireless dedication and the way she led without needing to impose herself, he saw a woman the passage of time hadn't broken, but strengthened. That realization unsettled him, because it made clear what he had lost when he chose to leave, without giving them the chance to live what they could have lived. Now, standing before her, surrounded by responsibilities that demanded his full attention, He struggled to separate the businessman from the man who, out of pride or fear, had walked away from something that might have been the most genuine part of his life. The event was approaching quickly, and Aspen was transforming into a stage of expectations and silent renewals. The nature surrounding the city seemed complicit in everything that was happening. The trees swayed gently, as if watching from afar the unfolding of something deeper than any corporate plan. The fresh mountain air carried untold stories, and the setting was becoming more symbolic by the day. A city in harmony with the environment, two hearts trying to maintain order amid the chaos the reunion had caused, and a launch that promised to change not only the company's image, but also the paths of those who, unintentionally, were being transformed by it. The atmosphere in Aspen grew increasingly intense as the launch drew nearer, demanding more frequent and detailed strategic meetings between the holdings team and local representatives. It marked the beginning of a new phase of the project, aligning the brand's global intentions with the community's real needs. It was in this context, in a spacious room at the convention center surrounded by windows that framed the pine-covered mountains, that the first official meeting took place. He arrived flanked by his advisors and managers, carrying the serene demeanor of someone used to making decisions in sophisticated settings. Yet neither the rehearsed protocol nor the carefully prepared reports could shield him from the impact of seeing her again. This time, not as a persistent memory, but as an integral part of that environment, wearing a leadership badge and holding a position of influence in front of everyone. She appeared with the ease of someone who knew every corner of the town and every person involved in the project. Her speech was firm, precise, filled with authenticity, as she presented the community's needs, the necessary schedule adjustments, and suggestions for integrating local suppliers. She displayed mastery and confidence, like someone who hadn't just prepared for that moment, but who had built her reputation through years of quiet dedication. He watched her with the kind of attention he once reserved only for major international negotiators, but this time, his gaze carried more than technical analysis. There was astonishment, admiration, and a painful trace of regret. The woman standing before him was no longer the young girl he once left behind, but a solid, respected figure whose presence filled the room with subtle authority and genuine respect. The meeting moved forward with clear agendas, concrete proposals, and strategic adjustments, and despite the professionalism they both demonstrated, there was something invisible lingering in the space between their gestures and glances, something unnoticed by others, but deeply felt by them. Other participants picked up on the slight silence that hung between their exchanges, as if there were a layer of meaning beyond the spoken words. No word was said out of place. No movement seemed inappropriate, but the tension was there, restrained, controlled, yet undeniable. For her, maintaining balance required an almost superhuman effort. As she presented the technical points clearly, her heart pounded inside, resisting every memory that tried to invade her mind upon seeing him so close, so real, so different, and yet hauntingly familiar. The maturity she had gained over the years didn't erase what she had lived through, but it had taught her how to reorganize those memories so they would no longer wound her. Even so, in that moment, as she watched him taking notes, responding with care, and measuring every word as he always had, she realized that certain feelings never completely disappear. They just go quiet, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And that moment had arrived. There was no longer any denying the impact his presence had on her. But now she was no longer the young woman who waited for letters, nor the girl who cried alone when she realized he had left without even saying goodbye. Now she was a whole woman, shaped by hard choices, responsibilities, and accomplishments that didn't rely on anyone's approval. And it was with that composure that she led the meeting to its end without hesitation, even amid the silent chaos unfolding within her. For him, every word she spoke echoed louder than any data presented during the meeting. The way she articulated ideas, the respect she earned from everyone, the confidence with which she defended her proposals, all of it struck him deeply. It was as if time had given him a chance to see what he had lost, not because there wasn't love, but because of a rushed decision, forced by circumstances, and the fear of committing to something he couldn't control. At the time, he thought leaving would be easier than staying and facing the uncertainties. Now he understood the true cost of that decision, and there, in that room full of strategies and corporate goals, he realized that no business success could fill the void left by everything he might have built alongside her. Still, He also recognized that time keeps moving forward, and what now existed between them was a different kind of story, deeper, more complex, and perhaps still full of possibility. When the meeting ended, the participants slowly dispersed, exchanging formal greetings and setting the next steps for the project. She stayed for a few more minutes, organizing documents, speaking with members of the local team, and wrapping up smaller points with the professionalism that defined her. He hesitated before leaving, as if searching for a reason to stay a bit longer. But there was no room for improvisation at that moment. He knew that any gesture out of context could be misinterpreted, so he just watched her, in silence, before leaving the room. Her image, calm, focused, and admired by all, stayed with him for the rest of the day, not as a shadow of the past, but as a tangible presence that challenged everything he thought he had left behind. The days following the first meeting unfolded in a silent choreography between the two of them. In public, they maintained the impeccable composure expected of them. She, engaged with community demands and local decisions. He, focused on the holding company's guidelines and the deadlines he had to meet. They passed each other in hallways, had lunch at the same executive meetings, attended parallel events, and never once allowed even a hint of intimacy or discomfort to show. It was as if they had made a tacit pact of neutrality, a mutual effort to mask what still pulsed beneath the surface. The indifference they displayed was precise, calculated, almost rehearsed, as if both feared that a single lingering glance might bring to the surface everything they had tried to erase over time. Yet this apparent calm hid something that grew quietly, a constant restlessness, fueled by memories that returned with force, even in the most mundane moments. She tried to keep her distance, devoting herself fully to her responsibilities. Her focus was on building bridges between the project and the community, ensuring that commitments to the residents were met with ethics and respect. And indeed, she managed to keep the pace, facing challenging meetings, coordinating teams, mediating differing interests. But no matter how hard she tried, there was always a moment when he would appear in her line of sight, in a conversation with one of the investors, in the corner of a room flipping through reports, in an involuntary, restrained smile. In those moments, even without allowing herself to stop, her heart would involuntarily race, as if something long dormant was beginning to awaken slowly, testing the limits of her rationality. The memory of him, once a distant trace of youth, now took concrete shape, present, alive, and that stirred everything she believed she had already overcome. On his side, control had always been an ally. Accustomed to intense corporate environments and negotiations that required absolute composure, he mastered the art of suppressing impulses and managing emotions with precision, and it was exactly that self-control he used to handle their renewed proximity. He didn't show surprise at seeing her again, avoided any unnecessary closeness, and treated her with the formal respect expected in professional situations. Yet inside, something was off balance. The image he held of her from the past, marked by the lightness of youth and memories of a love interrupted, now blended with the tangible presence of the woman she had become. And this merging of past and present created a confusion he could no longer ignore. With each meeting, each of her comments, each brief formal interaction, he felt the weight of what he had lost, and at the same time, an increasing fascination with who she had now revealed herself to be. The tension between them wasn't visible to others, but it followed them like a cold breeze cutting through the air. It lingered in the silences between greetings, in the overly careful way they chose their words, in glances that darted away too quickly to seem natural. It was present above all in solitary moments, when one or the other found themselves remembering old times, unfinished conversations, dreams that never had the chance to take shape. She began to realize that, no matter how much she pretended to feel nothing, there was something there that escaped her control, something that hadn't disappeared, only gone dormant, waiting for a crack to reemerge. And the daily coexistence, even wrapped in formalities, acted as a kind of catalyst, rekindling feelings she thought she had buried forever. The time that had distanced them had not been strong enough to dissolve what once existed. It had merely covered it with layers of silence, now subtly and steadily coming back to life. He noticed those cracks too, every detail about her, the way she listened intently, how she subtly responded to colleagues' provocations, how she smiled discreetly at something that moved her, revealed nuances he hadn't known before, or perhaps hadn't noticed in the past. And in rediscovering those parts of her, he felt he was in front of an even more captivating version of the woman he once loved. It wasn't just longing, it was a rediscovery that left him unsteady. Amid marketing strategies, sustainability discussions, and shareholder meetings, he found himself watching her. Not out of nostalgia, but out of genuine curiosity about who she had become. It was as if, silently, he wanted to recover the time they had lost, even knowing that some past choices couldn't be undone. Despite the effort both made to maintain composure, the past crept in through unexpected cracks. A particular spot in the city, a background song during a cocktail event, a comment from an old local. Everything seemed to somehow conspire to revive what still existed between them. But instead of facing that truth directly, they chose the path of pretense. They acted as if nothing had changed, as if they were merely professionals fulfilling their roles in an important project. However, this pretending began to take its toll. Emotional fatigue built up, and the safe distance they maintained became, paradoxically, more laden with meaning than any closeness. It was a silent war in which neither dared to take the first step, but both knew, deep down, that they were being pulled into something greater than reason could contain. The event schedule moved into its most intense and demanding phase, and with that, the distance they insisted on maintaining became impossible. The planning had reached a critical point. The coordination of the main launch space would now be a shared responsibility between her, who deeply understood Aspen's local identity and expectations, and him, who brought the global vision and held the final responsibility for the successful execution of the eco-friendly product line. The integration between the two was non-negotiable. Faced with tight deadlines, strict sustainability protocols, and the need to meet the holding company's standards, every decision had to be made jointly. This formal requirement exposed them to an intense, daily, inescapable collaboration, creating a practical partnership even amid the personal tension they carried beneath their restrained gestures. Each morning began to take shape in the same improvised workspaces, a repurposed warehouse for meetings, project tables, designated areas for material testing and logistics, all infused with a frenetic routine. They ended up adjusting schedules alone, reviewing the environmental awareness program together, inspecting sustainable promotional materials, overseeing the selection of eco-friendly giveaways, and approving the placement of informational panels highlighting the principles of the new line. Daily interaction required proximity during decision-making, in compressed lunch breaks, during commutes between setup areas, in conversations with mutual project acquaintances. These were imperceptible moments, subtle exchanges that became inevitable, because the event's logistics tied them together more than any outside force could. The routine also gradually dismantled the cold protocol they had maintained. Faced with a tight timeline, she began to rely on his presence to handle unexpected issues, and he started decentralizing decisions he once made alone, trusting her local insight. Their collaboration started to build upon the convergence of their strengths. Their technical skills were complementary, and the event demanded exactly that. She introduced thoughtful solutions to avoid environmental impact, implemented sustainable practices in catering, lighting, and waste management. He brought in specialized professionals, ensured certified suppliers, and confirmed that all contracts aligned with the holding's global corporate responsibility policies. The result was a joint effort that captured the best of each of them. However, this immersion in the intense routine came with invisible costs: short nights, constant concern for the event's quality, anxiety over crowd size, and how the media would respond. The clash between professional commitment and emotional comfort became inevitable. Each glance exchanged over spreadsheets or almost accidental touches when passing documents became points of silent tension. The physical workspace, surrounded by mountain scenery, turned the presence of the other from coincidence into a permanent condition. There was no pretending indifference anymore, because executing the project well meant using that forced partnership as a real foundation of trust, even if the feelings holding it up were conflicted. She began to notice that her emotions, once held tightly behind indifference, responded with renewed force to the closeness now required. A simple gesture from him, like helping carry a heavy box of display panels, stirred a current of sensations she believed long forgotten. The warmth of his presence, the professional security he projected, caused a growing confusion in her between what was functional and what was personal. He, in turn, was struck by seeing his former partner handle complex tasks with mastery, hearing her guidance on community preferences, watching her navigate delicate decisions with the calm of someone deeply rooted. Business logic began to blend with repressed affection, tangling responsibility with dormant desires. Each day, their collaboration became more fluid, and with that, the emotional barrier grew weaker. They started to understand each other without speaking, compensating for one another's traits in technical decisions, last-minute adjustments, and rapid response crises. Their teamwork evolved from pragmatic to complementary, and that complementarity echoed in how each responded to the other's presence. He began to anticipate her input with more attentiveness than anyone else on the team, and she began seeking his approval before making impactful decisions. This professional equilibrium solidified, even though each gesture still carried the weight of an unresolved story. But the demands of daily coexistence also worked on an emotional level. Moments that were once formal began to hold real meaning. An unexpected encounter at the makeshift cafe, a conversation about logistics after hours, a glance that lingered longer than it should have. All of it built a new unspoken connection between the two. Without admitting it, they began to look forward to each other's company in the rush of the day, and the truth became clear. They were experiencing, in that shared space, within the tireless demands of the project, an emotional reunion that went beyond corporate necessity. It was a quiet rebuilding of what had once been interrupted, now wrapped in the forced routine of collaboration. The impact of this dynamic was also reflected in how the community perceived the event. Local volunteers and partners picked up on the harmony between the two leaders. There was a visible energy in how they led activities, a genuine commitment that went beyond formality. She began to receive praise from local colleagues for her vision and assertiveness, but also for her synergy with the holding's representative. He, in turn, had his respect reaffirmed as he watched her handle tense situations with transparency and balance, proving that beneath the expected professional decorum, there was a real human connection, even if unspoken. This collective recognition sparked a profound shift in the event. It was no longer just the launch of eco-friendly products. It had become a living experience, built with soul, remembered as a defining moment for the city. Then came the final challenges: testing sound and lighting equipment, rehearsals, assembling eco-stands, sponsor visits, last-minute supplier adjustments, negotiations with local authorities, permits for setting up outdoor structures. Everything required immediate decisions, project reviews, and a redefinition of roles. Together, they absorbed the impact of every misstep, fixing problems through the night, reorganizing empty spaces, reallocating teams, and reworking crowd flows. Each joint challenge brought them closer, reducing silences and feeding a subtle yet precise complicity. Their daily partnership created moments where they both felt supported by one another, even without acknowledging that support aloud. Their connection became a kind of emotional and professional synchronicity, one that, though unspoken, was felt by everyone. At the end of each intense day, when the event's buzz finally died down, they would pause, even for just a few seconds, to observe the result of their shared effort. Panels displaying environmental data, expressions of approval from the local public, sustainably created art displayed with care, giveaways spreading messages of awareness. Everything reflected the integration of corporate and community values, and, implicitly, the integration of the two of them. As the warehouse doors closed at the end of each day, they were left alone in the silence that followed the commotion. And it was in that silence that they realized daily coexistence had drawn them close, in a way that made the bridge between past and present impossible to ignore. They had stopped pretending to be indifferent. The past, once silent, had become a concrete foundation for a new possibility, and that possibility was now growing uncontrollably, embedded in the harmony that only intense coexistence can build. The days following the beginning of their intense collaboration initially seemed like a continuation of the professional rhythm that had absorbed them. However, with exhaustion came vulnerability. The frequency with which they had to handle urgent decisions, manage unforeseen events, and resolve issues demanding immediate attention exposed them to minor frictions, disagreements that extended beyond their professional roles. A simple conflict over the use of recyclable materials from a particular supplier, or the placement of informational panels, triggered more heated reactions than the situations warranted. These weren't serious arguments. but they revealed deeper layers behind their technical choices. The way he rigidly defended certain decisions and how she challenged him with a critical, pragmatic gaze reflected more than just stylistic differences. It spoke of old wounds, unresolved pains that time hadn't fully erased. With every clash, something bigger seemed to surface between them. She remembered how he used to become inflexible whenever he felt control slipping through his fingers, and she saw that same pattern now. But unlike in the past, she no longer remained silent, no longer yielded out of fear of breaking things. She showed that she had grown stronger, that she knew where her responsibility ended, and his began. He, too, saw her with new eyes. She was no longer the young woman who accepted silences and absences to keep the peace. She had matured, learned to set boundaries, and stood by her choices with conviction. That transformation threw him off. Deep down, he admired the change, even if he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. These isolated clashes didn't prevent the work from continuing, but they introduced a new type of tension, one that pulled them closer rather than driving them apart. The forced proximity revealed more than old resentments. It brought to the surface memories that crept in during the most unexpected moments. A gesture she made while organizing documents, an expression he wore while analyzing the schedule, an accidental touch as they reached for the same material. Each moment carried a memory that had, until then, rested quietly in the background. They surfaced not with pain, but with a gentle, almost sweet, longing. He realized how much he had forgotten the sound of her laugh when solving a problem creatively. She noticed that she still recognized the look in his eyes when he felt pressured, and that somehow she still cared. Despite these memories, neither of them were the same anymore. She had known the weight of disappointment, but also the value of independence. He, for his part, had achieved the success he always pursued, but discovered it didn't fill the spaces she had once occupied. The versions of each other they once knew had been left behind, and what now existed were two adults with scars, choices made, and paths walked far from the time when they shared the same future. Still, even though they had gone in different directions, the closeness revealed that the affection remained, quiet, but present, not as a reflection of the past, but as something rebuilt through proximity. Small gestures became signs of this rediscovery. When he saw her concerned about the local team struggling to manage one of the event's structures, he discreetly intervened, releasing additional resources to ease the workload, without her needing to ask. When she learned he had spent the night fixing a critical flaw in the security contracts, she single-handedly prepared the morning segment of the event so he could rest. These actions were never discussed, but they had profound effects. There was care between the lines, an unspoken attentiveness, increasingly visible, as if both, by recognizing how much they had changed, were also silently admitting that the feelings they once shared had never completely disappeared. The most unexpected part was that, in seeing each other differently, they also became more truthful. The social masks, the barriers shaped by separation and time, began to fall. She no longer made an effort to seem distant, and he stopped trying to hide how closely he watched her. In one specific moment, when a cultural attraction had to be relocated due to a rain forecast, they found themselves alone in a makeshift warehouse, reorganizing the schedule. The silence that once felt awkward now felt comfortable. Neither mentioned the past, but there was a moment when their gaze lingered too long, and in that gaze, they recognized something that didn't need translation. The connection was still there, alive, held by a thread. The maturity that once separated them also became the bridge that brought them back together, because now, they no longer looked to the other to save them from their own emptiness. Now, they found understanding. She grasped his absences with more clarity, and he saw the strength she had built on her own. The mistakes of the past hadn't vanished, but they became less painful in the face of the mutual respect they had begun to rebuild. It was a reunion of souls that understood the cost of time, but could still recognize one another even after walking opposite paths. The feelings, though unspoken, didn't need declarations. They were present in their actions, in the decisions they shared, in the moments when one gave way for the other's sake. As the event neared its peak, and the city began to feel the impact of the initiative, the energy between them intensified. It was no longer just about delivering a successful project, but about dealing with the emotions that had resurfaced amid the enforced routine. They had learned to operate together in the chaos, but more importantly, They had learned to coexist with their own transformations. Those small clashes were no longer signs of conflict. They had become reflections of change. And in each other's reflection, they understood that the old feelings may have never left. They had merely slept, waiting for the right time to return, with a new shape and greater truth. The succession of professional commitments and the emotional rediscovery between the two gained even more depth as Aspen's winter settled in. The white covering the mountains seemed to mute the noise of the past, but also highlighted it with greater clarity. The silent landscapes, marked by snowy trails and the constant whisper of wind through tall trees, created an emotional frame that touched them both in a personal way. Every walk between event sites, every morning layered in frost, and every sunset bathed in golden icy light brought a sense of pause, as if time slowed to allow them to see each other more clearly, and that only amplified what was already forming between them. It wasn't just the beauty of the place, but the intensity it evoked, awakening deep memories and thick silences that needed no explanation. The town itself, with its elegant buildings, the quiet charm of fireplace-lit cafes, and the calm routine of residents accustomed to the cold, conveyed a sense of retreat and introspection. This directly shaped how the two began to interact. Their daily collaboration continued, but the rare breaks they shared carried an almost intimate quality. They walked side by side through the frozen streets in silence, past hurried tourists and locals, and even without exchanging words, an invisible form of communication grew stronger. They no longer avoided each other as they had in the beginning, nor did they clash like during their early disagreements. Now, they were immersed in a tacit understanding, surrounded by the visual stillness of winter, which contrasted with the emotional intensity quietly building between them. That silent connection deepened in simple moments, ones that had no romantic intention, but ended up being more intense than any planned gesture. On a particularly cold morning, during an inspection of the facilities in a more remote part of town, the car they were using had to be parked far from the main entrance, and they walked for several minutes through the snow. She huddled inside her thick coat, trying to keep pace, and he, in an automatic gesture, slowed down to match her steps. There was no physical contact, but the care was there, palpable. Their boots left tracks in the soft snow, and the muffled sound of the wind through the trees made that moment feel suspended in time. Neither of them spoke about it, but the memory of that shared cold stayed with them like a silent secret. Aspen's geography, with its natural slopes and the constant presence of mountains in the background, reinforced the feeling of isolation, not as loneliness, but as if they were in a pause from the world. It drew them even closer. There was no room for distractions, or for the social pressures that had once kept them bound to roles and obligations. The setting offered a rare chance to see each other without the usual filters. The majestic nature, with its contrasts of light and shadow, echoed the emotions they were trying to control, especially at the end of the day, when the sky darkened earlier and the deep blue of the cold afternoon colored the horizon. They remained in the same space, side by side, watching the team wrap up work with a kind of serenity they hadn't experienced before. The harmony between them showed in the absence of noise, in the mutual acceptance of that shared space. Those days in Aspen, intensified by the cold, the quiet beauty of the mountains, and the geographical isolation, became the perfect backdrop for what had been dormant between them to rise to the surface, without the need to be named. The past was no longer an intrusive presence, but a quiet reference that now found an echo in the present. With every shared decision, every glance exchanged during meetings or last-minute adjustments, an invisible bond was solidifying. Their time together had stopped being an obligation and turned into a refuge, and the surrounding environment, with its almost ethereal atmosphere, offered the silence they needed to listen, to themselves and to each other, with greater clarity. The nostalgia that settled in wasn't just for the time they had spent together, but for who they were back then. Comparing what they had felt before to what they were discovering now became inevitable. She saw herself as more grounded, more confident, and he recognized himself as more open, more receptive to what he had once ignored. Aspen wasn't just the place of their physical reunion, it was the setting where their internal worlds finally connected in a more conscious way. The cold didn't drive them apart. On the contrary, it made them seek warmth in what still connected them, even in silence. And in the whiteness of the mountains, feelings took shape not through declarations or promises, but through gestures and the constancy of one another's presence. It was an intimacy built to the rhythm of the landscape, slow, deep, and inevitable. The conclusion of the community event represented more than the execution of a carefully planned project. It was the symbolic peak of a silent emotional buildup between the two. The activities were successful, partnerships strengthened, and the local community was deeply engaged and grateful. The celebrations were discreet, like everything else in that mountain-surrounded town, where even great achievements seemed to whisper rather than shout. She remained at the center of operations until the end, confidently managing every detail, while he, leading the holdings team, showed, though reservedly, genuine satisfaction with the outcome. But even with the official closing and the exchanged words of thanks, something essential remained unfinished. What had grown between them over the days persisted, as if patiently waiting for the right moment to reveal itself fully. That night, when the last guests had already left, and the lights at the venue were beginning to dim, the weather, which had favored them until then, revealed its most unpredictable side. The snowstorm arrived without clear warning, quickly turning the streets into white, silent corridors. Most of the company's team had already left, settling into nearby inns and chalets, and she also planned to return home when she realized the snow made any travel unsafe. He, intending to return to the hotel with the others, found himself stuck as well. They ended up alone inside the community center hall, sheltered by the remaining warmth of the fireplaces, and surrounded by windows now showing the icy swirl outside. There was no music, no ongoing celebration, just the muffled sound of snow tapping against the glass and the faint crackling of wood still burning in the hearths. They sat, unhurried, on opposite sides of the same room, naturally sharing the silence. Their eyes exchanged discreet glances, as if every gesture said more than any words. What lingered between them wasn't discomfort, but a kind of understanding that needed no explanation. They were there, after everything, not just because of the storm, but because of something greater that kept them close. Even though it had never been spoken aloud, the cold outside contrasted with the growing warmth of their shared presence, which was slowly becoming more comforting, more real. Time moved strangely in that room. The minutes stretched as if the world outside had stopped, as if Aspen, blanketed by the storm, had paused its routine to make room for that overdue encounter. Sitting before the fire, the heat of the crackling wood softly lit their faces, revealing expressions more relaxed, more bare of defenses. It was the first time in weeks that they didn't have to maintain a professional front or restrain themselves for the sake of respectful coexistence. They were free, even if just for a moment, to simply be who they were in front of each other, and that space of authenticity created an opening through which stored-up emotions began to seep in, not hurriedly, but firmly. The memories, until then dormant, took on a new shape in that context, not as a weight from the past, but as a bond, a natural continuation of what had always existed between them. The memories of their youth, the diverging paths, the decisions made, and the silences that had accumulated over the years no longer separated them. That night, held together by a natural phenomenon that isolated them from the rest of the world, they were able to see in each other what had always resisted time, the ability to recognize one another, even transformed. The once restrained glances began to linger. The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving. The storm outside was violent, but inside, what settled was the peace of a rediscovered connection. Nothing happened abruptly. There were no declarations or impulsive gestures, just the continued presence of two people in the same space, the shared warmth of the fire, the slow accumulation of snowflakes outside, and the silence filled with meaning. It was in this setting that everything changed. Not because something new had begun, but because everything that had resisted time finally found the right moment to be embraced. They were alone, yes, but no longer lonely. The snowstorm had physically confined them, but it also dissolved the last emotional barriers they had held up out of caution. With the worsening of the storm and an official recommendation from local authorities for everyone to avoid traveling, one of the event coordinators, anticipating the risk of prolonged isolation, made a nearby cabin available to the team. It was a simple but comfortable structure, stocked with supplies, a fireplace, blankets, and everything needed to safely spend the night until the weather cleared. With no viable alternative and unable to reach their original destinations, the two accepted the temporary solution. They walked to the cabin through the relentless snow, their faces partly hidden under the hoods of their coats, and their steps slow on the snow-covered ground. The silence persisted, but this time it wasn't filled with tension. It carried a strange sense of complicity, as if both of them understood that something inevitable was drawing near. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. The dark wood walls, the scent of pine burning in the fireplace, the soft light from old lamps, and the gentle creak of the wooden floor created a sense of refuge. There was an almost surreal tranquility, as if the outside world had temporarily ceased to exist. After lighting the fire and removing their snow-soaked clothes, they settled into opposite chairs by the fireplace, blankets draped over their shoulders, and mugs of hot tea in hand. At first, they simply stayed like that, watching the flames, listening to the crackling logs, and feeling the heat slowly bring sensation back to their frozen bodies. The silent connection they had shared at the community center now took on a clearer, almost tangible intimacy. With time, words began to surface, not rushed, but like someone finally finding room to breathe after years of restraint. They talked about the event, the community, the impact of the social initiatives in the town. Slowly, the conversation shifted to memories of their youth, to moments long kept somewhere in the back of their minds, dormant. They recalled the days of walking the same school halls, chance encounters at local parties, the summer when everything felt possible before life pulled them in different directions. The conversation wasn't linear. It wandered freely, like the kind shared between two people who truly know each other and understand the layers behind every pause. It wasn't just about revisiting the past. It was about facing it with the maturity gained over the years. They were no longer the same young dreamers full of impulsive plans. They had scars, experiences, and choices that shaped them differently. And still, in the subtle light in their eyes, something had endured, not as a leftover from what once was, but as a truer version of what could have been. The long conversation by the fire didn't carry a tone of confrontation or urgency. It was, above all, a reunion of souls who, despite the distance, had never stopped moving toward one another, even without realizing it. As the night wore on, and the wind howled outside against the windows, the warmth inside the cabin felt stronger than just the fire's heat. Their words drew them closer in subtle ways, dissolving the walls they had built out of pride or self-preservation. The differences that once drove them apart no longer seemed as relevant compared to who they had become. Both silently acknowledged that they had changed. Their experiences had made them more aware, more cautious, but also more open to seeing each other with new eyes. There was mutual respect in the subtext of every sentence, an acknowledgement of each other's journey, of what had been lived, what had been lost, and most of all, what could still be rebuilt. Midnight arrived without them noticing. The storm continued, but time inside the cabin moved to a different rhythm. There was no longer a need to maintain guarded posture. The space allowed them to simply be two human beings, rediscovering affection, connection, and understanding after years marked by silence. The conversation faded at some point, but the silence that followed was unlike any that had come before. It wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, of all the things that no longer needed to be said because they had already been felt. The other's presence now felt familiar, comforting, almost inevitable. The fire still burned, the shadows danced on the walls, and their hearts, once shielded by layers of past and distance, were finally exposed, and at peace. The night continued in silence, but no longer one of emptiness. There was an almost imperceptible movement in the air, as if each passing second brought to the surface another layer of the shared history between them. The fireplace cast shadows on the wooden walls, and the warmth that filled the space contrasted with the force of the wind still blowing outside, making every inch of that room feel like a time capsule where the past gently unfolded. Slowly, they began to revisit fragments of their youth, memories they had long avoided confronting. It wasn't just a casual talk about old times, but an emotional revisiting, where each memory carried the weight of the decisions that had pulled them apart, and of the absences that accumulated in the silences over the years. She remembered the moments when she felt left behind, the dreams she had to abandon while he followed his path toward a distant world, driven by ambitions that at the time seemed to allow no detours. He, in turn, acknowledged the empty spaces that opened in his life after she disappeared from his daily routine, and the way he tried to fill them with schedules, achievements, and a facade of indifference. That night didn't become a reckoning, but rather a rare opening where past hurts were revealed not with the intent to wound, but from a genuine need to be seen and understood. There was no blame, only silent confessions of how each had felt the loss of the other at different moments, for reasons that only now seemed clear. The environment made it possible. The old wood of the cabin seemed to absorb the words and protect what was said, as if it offered shelter not only from the cold outside, but from the fear of being exposed. The fire still burning in the hearth softly lit their expressions, revealing in their eyes what the voice often hesitated to say. When they shared their most vulnerable memories, there was no room left for masks. Only the real versions of each remained, not the idealized or distorted ones shaped by time, but those formed by absence, waiting, and reunion. The unveiling of their wounds didn't create a new break, but instead a more solid ground on which to rebuild something. It was as if, by finally placing their pain on the table, they could see that the suffering they carried hadn't made them more distant, but closer, because it came from the same place, a love that had never been fully lived. That realization didn't require grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was present in the way they looked at each other after every confession, as if both were relieved to finally be understood. And more than that, to still recognize themselves in each other despite the marks time had left behind. The connection between them, far from being just comfortable nostalgia, revealed itself to be deep and present. It was no longer sustained merely by sweet memories of an idealized past, but by an acceptance of what they had lived separately, and by a desire, however quiet, to explore what they might still live together, now with eyes wide open. In that limited space, the entire world seemed to fit between them. Time had been suspended, not just by the storm, but by the emotional surrender built in every shared silence, in every memory retrieved without hurry, and in every pain acknowledged with respect. As the early signs of dawn finally began to break through the long night, the storm outside started to ease. Snow still blanketed the landscape, but the wind had lost its strength, as if nature, like them, had reached a point of rest after the turmoil. Inside the cabin, nothing felt urgent. It was as if the outside world still didn't exist, and all that mattered was right there, between two bodies warmed by the fire, and two souls that had found each other again, not by chance, but by a force that had never truly faded, not even through time, distance, or silence. The night had slowly come to an end, as if each passing second had been devoted to rebuilding what time hadn't been able to erase. The storm, worn down by the hours, gave way to a shy dawn filtered through the cabin's foggy windows. Outside, the snow remained thick, blanketing the ground and rooftops with a white layer that shimmered under the pale light of a new day. Inside, however, the warmth no longer came solely from the fireplace. It was in the air, dense and silent, shaped by everything that had been shared during that night of revelations. The reunion between them, which had begun with discomfort and restraint, had transformed into a deep dive into what still endured between them. The words they had exchanged didn't promise a future, but they had dismantled the barriers that once kept them apart. The kiss that sealed that moment didn't come from urgency or regret. It was a natural response to the truth that had emerged between sincere confessions and glances that no longer looked away. It was a calm, lingering gesture, one that didn't seek rushed beginnings, but rather the quiet confirmation that something still existed, strong and real, among the ruins and reconstructions time had brought. The closeness between them didn't need words to be affirmed. Their bodies, once restrained by the tension of a distance disguised in formality, now found rest in each other. It wasn't a fleeting desire or impulsive nostalgia. It was intimacy relearned, recognized, and respected. The lips that met in that kiss carried the flavor of years held back, but also of maturity. There were no empty promises, no vows made in the heat of the moment. It was simply the now, enough and intense. In that gesture, they both understood that what they were building didn't require definitive declarations. Time, which had once separated them, now offered a new rhythm. And even if they didn't know what tomorrow would bring, the night they had just lived served as a solid foundation, where sincerity finally replaced silence and affection replaced fear. The touch was gentle, but carried a meaning neither of them dared to name aloud. They were fully aware they were no longer the young people who had said goodbye years ago at that cold train station, when their paths diverged amid restrained tears and unspoken words. Now, in front of the fireplace, under the soft light of a snow-covered dawn, they were adults marked by loss, choices, and growth. And yet, despite all the changes, something had remained intact: the possibility of love. A love that didn't need to be inflamed by grand promises, but sustained by the clarity of what they felt in that moment. The kiss, then, didn't just symbolize the reunion of two bodies, but the recognition that, despite all transformation, the feeling that once united them still pulsed, in a new form, more conscious and serene. The sun had already grown stronger when morning finally settled in, slowly melting some of the snow clinging to the chalet's windows. The night's silence was replaced by the timid sounds of thaw, the fading crackle of the fireplace, and the awareness that the period of isolation was coming to an end. In that delicate interval between what had been lived during the night and what the next day would demand, they both knew something needed to be faced. He would have to leave. His schedule already called to him, and New York, with its imposing architecture, its non-negotiable obligations, and the demanding routine that had always set his pace, awaited his return. None of this was surprising, but in that moment, the weight of going back felt heavier. For the first time in years, he silently questioned the urgency with which he always threw himself back into the velocity of the city that never sleeps. The contrast was stark. Outside the chalet, the mountains still reflected a hypnotic calm, and the whiteness of the snow spread across Aspen's landscape formed a quiet invitation to stay. But within him, an old mechanism had been activated, the one that always made him prioritize obligations, goals, and absolute control over every aspect of his life. The flight was already booked. Commitments were waiting. Still, the way he looked at her that morning was different. In his eyes, there wasn't just the ache of early longing, but also an unspoken conflict between what he felt there and what he knew he had to do. The goodbye wasn't marked by dramatic words or impulsive gestures. It was silent, dense, and full of everything they couldn't put into words. They both knew that nothing they had lived that night would be erased, but they also understood that starting something true would require more than just the echo of a kiss. She walked him to the chalet door, and the cold creeping back into the air seemed to intensify the harshness of the moment. It wasn't the first time he had left, but now, unlike in the past, there was something between them that couldn't be buried by absence. The bond, though subtle, had taken root in an unexpected way. She didn't try to stop him from leaving, just as he didn't pretend his routine awaited him with excitement. They both understood that what they had lived needed space to grow, even from a distance, and perhaps that was exactly what made the separation so painful. Not because they were reliving what they had lost in the past, but because they realized what they might lose again if they didn't find a way to keep it alive. He hugged her with the firmness of someone who didn't want to let go, but with the caution of someone who still didn't know how to fit that feeling into his life. As he left the chalet, carrying only a small bag, he felt the symbolic weight of what he was leaving behind. It wasn't just a weekend in the mountains. It was a reunion with parts of himself that New York had kept dormant for years. The sound of the car in the snow grew fainter until it disappeared completely, while she stood at the door, watching the emptiness take the place he had occupied seconds earlier. The house seemed larger, quieter, as if the space itself had sensed the absence. But inside her, something was different. The connection between them hadn't been a whim. It was an old scar transformed into possibility, and even if physical distance separated them once again, what they had lived wouldn't be undone. She knew that, and he, even without looking back, carried the certainty that that goodbye wasn't the end, just a pause, which time, with its own logic, would know how to navigate. When the sound of the car was completely gone, and the last trace of his presence dissolved into the morning chill, she went back inside, like someone gathering what remains of a moment that wouldn't be repeated anytime soon. But there, within the walls still warmed by the fire that softly burned in the hearth, there was more than absence. There were fresh memories, traces of lingering glances, and the sweet weight of an intimacy rediscovered. Still, she knew that life couldn't stop to nurture what was still uncertain. There was a grandmother waiting, someone who depended on her constant presence. The woman who had raised her with tenderness and strength now required daily care, not only due to her fragile health, but because her lucidity fluctuated between moments of clarity and others overtaken by distorted memories. And it was in that fluctuation that she found the strength to remain in Aspen, anchored by ties that could not be abandoned, not even for love. Life there was intense, but it didn't carry the weight of cold obligations. It was a rhythm shaped by love and meaning. Every morning started early with preparing her grandmother's medications, caring for the house, and then dedicating herself to the social projects she had built over the years. The community center, which supported vulnerable residents through the harsh winter, was the result of her persistence. She kept it running through local donations, quiet partnerships, and a great deal of personal effort. She handed out blankets, organized hot meals, and followed up with families who depended on the emotional and material support the place offered. For many, she was more than just a coordinator. She was a symbol of hope and stability. And even when exhaustion threatened to overcome her, she never allowed her dedication to waver. Every gesture, every word of gratitude from those she helped, reaffirmed her certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. Even with her heart still echoing the moments spent by his side, she knew that Aspen was more than just a backdrop for memories. It was her harbor, her foundation, the place where she had learned to turn pain into service, and where she had found a purpose that went beyond herself. The nights, though solitary, were not empty. She filled her time with reading by the fireplace, writing reports on her activities, and planning improvements for the community center. When her thoughts insisted on returning to the night of the kiss and the silent goodbye, she welcomed them without resistance, but without letting them paralyze her. She knew there was a difference between remembering and living in the past, and at that moment, her present demanded wholeness. Still, the emptiness that spread through the quietest hours was undeniable. He had left a space behind, and even though she tried to fill it with tasks and responsibilities, something was pulsing, a feeling that refused to be forgotten. The love she had felt for him in her youth had matured, just as she had. It was no longer the impulsive charm of a first love, but something deeper, quieter, that gained strength in the recognition of who he had become and who she herself had become. She didn't want him to give up the life he had built in New York, nor did she imagine abandoning the roots she had planted in Aspen. But deep within, she nurtured the quiet hope that time, once again, could act as an ally and allow once divergent paths to find a way to cross without demanding painful sacrifices. Until then, she would continue taking care of what was hers, the grandmother who taught her to be strong, the people who depended on the community center, and the seeds she planted every day in that mountain-surrounded town. It was her way of resisting the emptiness and keeping alive the flame of what she believed to be true. While she held firm to her routine in Aspen, caring for her grandmother, and the responsibilities that kept her rooted to that place, he, in New York, faced a kind of silent dissonance that began to creep into his days with the force of something that can't be ignored for long. Returning to the big city brought a dry reunion with reality. The office, the accumulated contracts, the reports that needed his approval, and the endless meetings that consumed every working hour of the week. Everything looked the same as the routine that had always sustained him, but what once made him feel productive and in control now left him unsettled. Amid the city's dazzling lights, the sound of sirens cutting through the night, and the relentless back and forth of obligations, he realized something inside him had changed, and that change no longer fit in a world with no room to pause. The days became mechanical. Even though he performed his duties with the same precision as always, there was a lingering absence between one task and the next, a distraction that began to weigh heavier than any workload. He found himself checking the clock often, not out of impatience, but because he felt time was being wasted. The moments of silence at the end of the day became increasingly uncomfortable. The spacious, luxurious penthouse he lived in no longer offered the comfort it once promised. The solitary dinners, half-finished glasses of wine, and news broadcasts playing in the background without his attention had become a reflection of what he was trying to avoid, the emptiness that set in when professional accomplishments were no longer enough. Aspen wouldn't leave his mind. The smell of burning wood in the fireplace, the calm of the snow-covered mountains, and most of all, her presence, steady, serene, with eyes full of story and strength, were now etched into his memory inescapably. He tried to rationalize it. He thought about the stark differences between them. She was tied to her roots, the community, her grandmother's care, and emotional commitments in a small town. He was immersed in strategic decisions, dealing with numbers, international contracts, and the constant pressure of maintaining the empire he had helped build. They lived in seemingly incompatible realities, at least on the surface. However, no matter how hard he tried to frame those differences as insurmountable obstacles, the feeling didn't go away. On the contrary, the memory of the quiet kiss, the exchanged glances by the fire, and the conversations filled with shared memories followed him even into the most impersonal spaces. In meetings, while listening to expansion strategies for emerging markets, he found himself wondering if she had finished distributing blankets at the community center that cold morning. During corporate lunches, he compared the elegance of wine glasses to the smell of the simple coffee she used to make beside the window overlooking the mountains. Everything felt like a constant reminder that somewhere out there, something real was waiting for him, and he still didn't know how to return to it. This inner tension, pulling him between the man who had to keep the business running and the one who had rediscovered something precious in the snow of Aspen, became unsustainable. The decision seemed impossible. One would have to yield. One would have to step out of their orbit so the other could fit into the new life they were both quietly beginning to want. But how could he ask that without tearing the other apart? How could he look at her, someone who had dedicated her life to her grandmother and to work that meant so much to so many people, and propose a change that might destroy everything she had built with such care? And at the same time, how could he walk away from the business structure that not only sustained his own life, but also that of hundreds of people who depended on the decisions he made every day? The doubt consumed him. Every option seemed to demand a sacrifice too great, and maybe that's why the fear of deciding kept him paralyzed, even knowing that her absence was becoming increasingly impossible to bear. Meanwhile, she also carried the same dilemma, though in silence. She knew asking him to come back would be unfair, just as leaving everything behind to follow him seemed unthinkable. And still, the feeling between them insisted on growing, defying logic, challenging time, and turning every decision into a kind of emotional risk. The love between them, mature and conscious, no longer fed on naive promises. It was sustained by the recognition of the depth of their bond, but also by the clear understanding that building a life together would take courage, not just to face the distance or the differences, but to break away from comfortable certainties and make room for something completely new. Time followed its course. The snow in Aspen gave way to a timid spring, which brought with it a lighter rhythm, yet did not erase what had been lived. She maintained her routine with determination, focusing on every task, every demand of the community center, on her grandmother's health, which still required delicate care. Even with her heart divided, she chose to remain present where she was needed, without allowing his absence to become an emotional prison. But despite all her effort, there were moments when the memories surfaced vividly, like when the wind blew across the porch, and she recalled the night they were both trapped by the storm, or during the afternoons when she helped children with homework, and remembered the stories he had told her about his lonely childhood. These memories didn't fade. On the contrary, they settled into her daily life, not consuming everything, but never fully disappearing. In the same way, he moved forward. He returned to his New York commitments with renewed focus, redirecting his energy toward the company's new projects, expanding partnerships, and planning a new phase of operations in other cities. However, even in moments of success, a part of him remained restless. She never left his thoughts, not as a fleeting memory, but as a constant presence that silently reshaped his priorities. It was in this context of change that the idea of opening a new branch in Seattle became more than just a strategic expansion. For him, it also meant creating something that could house both worlds that divided him so deeply, the world of business responsibility and the world of social sensitivity that she so naturally embodied. The invitation came unexpectedly. She was finishing an ordinary afternoon in Aspen, organizing files for a new volunteer program, when she received the company's official email. At the top, the familiar logo. Just below, the message detailing the proposal. The opening of a new branch in Seattle focused on social responsibility, sustainability, and community integration. Among the well-crafted words, her name appeared clearly, listed as the top candidate to lead the Community Impact Division. He had personally recommended her. The message held no sentimental language, no emotional remnants of what they had lived. But there was something in the choice of words, and especially in the gesture, that revealed everything left unsaid. It was more than a job offer. It was a bridge. As she finished reading, she felt the air shift around her. The room, once filled with distant voices and the sound of shuffling papers, suddenly grew quiet. This wasn't just a professional opportunity. It was a tangible opening for a new chapter, a chance to rebuild their story in a neutral space, without requiring either of them to fully give up their world. Seattle wasn't New York, with its relentless pace, nor was it Aspen, with its secluded stillness. It was a big enough city for new possibilities, yet open enough for what they had lived, and perhaps could still live. She understood in that moment that the invitation was his way of crossing the distance without invading her boundaries. It was his way of saying he wanted her close, but without asking her to abandon what mattered to her. The decision wasn't immediate. She spent days processing everything, mentally revisiting what she had felt in the past few months. She knew that accepting it would change everything, not just her geography, but also how she saw herself in the world. Accepting meant making space for him again, with all the complexities that entailed. But it also meant expanding the impact of her work, taking her dedication to communities to a new level. The doubt lingered through many nights, but deep down, a part of her had already decided. And that part spoke louder every time she remembered the way he looked at her. Not just with desire, but with genuine admiration, as if he saw in her something the whole world should see. And so, when she replied to the invitation with a yes, she felt she wasn't just accepting a new position. She was affirming, with grace and strength, that the bond between them deserved another chance. The move to Seattle was planned with care. She made sure her grandmother would remain well cared for, delegated tasks at the community center, and prepared for a new chapter in her life, one where her voice, her work, and her story would have a greater reach. When she landed in the new city, she carried little physical luggage but a significant emotional weight. Still, there was something different in her posture, the lightness of someone who chose with awareness, not dragged by emotion, but guided by it with her feet firmly on the ground. The welcome at the new office was warm, and though he wasn't there on her first day, his presence was felt in every detail of the space she would help transform. The new Seattle branch was inaugurated at a carefully planned event that reflected both the elegance of the corporate group and its renewed commitment to social causes as part of its institutional mission. The space had been redesigned to host not only commercial expansion strategies, but also ideas centered on inclusion, sustainability, and community impact, pillars she had helped implement with clarity and determination in the months leading up to that day. The walls reflected the contrast between concrete and humanity, between sleek modern architecture and panels featuring images of social projects already coming to life. The main auditorium was full. Guests from various regions attended: business leaders, local NGO representatives, activists, public figures, and residents already impacted by the first initiatives under her leadership. And she, in that context, was no longer just the woman who had left Aspen. She was now a respected figure, a voice that led the organization's new vision with both confidence and sensitivity. From the first hours of the event, her presence was noted not only for her professionalism, but also for the ease with which she moved among different audiences, clearly communicating the purpose behind each initiative presented. As she walked toward the stage to speak, she wore a simple yet elegant dress that contrasted with the tech-heavy backdrop of the room. Her speech was confident, direct, but filled with meaning. She didn't rely on dramatic phrases or rehearsed gestures. She spoke with truth. She spoke about her journey, about her work in Aspen, about the importance of listening to communities before acting on their behalf, and about how empathy, often invisible in large corporations, could become a tool for transformation if given the right space and investment. When she finished, the audience applauded at length. She smiled, but didn't search for him among the faces. She had chosen not to set expectations about his presence that day, even though she knew, quietly, that there was a chance he might appear. But he showed up. He didn't make an announcement, nor did he arrive with an entourage. He entered the auditorium quietly, minutes after her speech, wearing a dark suit and a look that blended restrained pride and vulnerability. He stood at the back of the room for a while, observing the faces, the atmosphere, the details of the new headquarters, but mostly observing her. She was no longer the woman he had met in Aspen. There was a steadier posture to her now, a serene confidence that came from someone who had made difficult choices and yet kept her tenderness intact. He only approached when the event was already moving toward the social gathering portion. And when their eyes finally met, time seemed to align with that scene at a meaningful, slow pace. There was no urgency between them anymore. It was no longer about rushing, promises, or apologies. It was about what still stood, even after distance, silence, and transformation. The reunion happened naturally. They stood before each other as two adults who had matured through the pain and discoveries time had imposed. There was no bitterness in either of their eyes, just a quiet recognition, as if both knew, without needing to say it, that what remained between them no longer required explanation. She didn't smile immediately, nor did she look away. She simply held his gaze, like someone accepting the return of a person who had never fully left. And he, in turn, remained composed. But something in the way he stood before her made it clear. He hadn't come just as a CEO endorsing a project. He had come as a man, as someone who had finally understood that certain connections aren't lost. They simply wait for the right time to bloom again. Over the next few minutes, they walked together through the halls of the headquarters, observing the spaces she had helped build. The environment was full of life, with informative panels, videos of initiatives in action, and photos documenting the early impacts of local projects. In every detail, her touch was evident. The care of someone who knew how to blend purpose and efficiency without losing sight of the human element. He listened attentively to every explanation, absorbing not just the facts, but also the intention behind each decision. She, in turn, spoke with confidence, without minimizing herself in his presence, without forgetting everything she had achieved. The dynamic between them was no longer marked by the tension of the past. Now there was room for mutual admiration, for the understanding that both had grown, and that perhaps time, the very same that had once pulled them apart, was finally working in their favor. Later, when most of the guests had already left and the auditorium began to quiet down, the two of them remained on the rooftop terrace, where the city view stretched before them, bathed in the soft light of dusk. The temperature was mild, the breeze gentle. Around them, the city pulsed with life, but in that suspended space, there seemed to be a bubble of time enclosing just the two of them. Neither of them needed to fill the silence with words. They were together, and that, in that moment, was enough. There were no promises or guarantees, only the acknowledgement that they were at a new starting point, one built on everything they had lived through, everything they had endured, and most importantly, on what they were still willing to build. The days that followed their reunion marked a new chapter, quiet and steady, like the careful rebuilding of something that had once been beautiful and was now being reborn on different foundations. They didn't need to rush anything. There were no grand declarations, no solemn promises. The bond between them had already been re-established before they began sharing spaces more regularly, and for that reason, each gesture between them carried a different weight. There was now a new kind of trust, born not just from the affection that had withstood the distance, but from the admiration that had grown through the way they had navigated their separate paths. She, with her genuine dedication, had turned community projects into long-lasting and deeply human initiatives. He, with his willingness to step back, had learned to weave success with purpose, redefining his journey and becoming more whole, both to the world and to himself. And when they began working side by side, not just within the same company, but toward the same purpose, their connection deepened even further. Life in Seattle settled into place naturally. The headquarters became a space where his vision and her heart could coexist, building projects that blended social impact with strategic planning. She led the teams with active listening, empathy, and clarity, while he negotiated expansions with the confidence of someone who had learned that success without awareness is just noise. At the end of each day, they shared both the exhaustion and the satisfaction of building something that went beyond spreadsheets and reports. They were creating a legacy, and throughout that journey, their emotional bond was reaffirmed organically. They no longer needed to avoid closeness or hide their feelings. The shared morning coffees, the walks after meetings, the knowing glances exchanged in chaotic moments, all of it became part of the landscape between them. It was as if time now was finally on their side. Neither of them had to choose between opposing worlds anymore. They had consciously chosen to build a new world together, one where urgency was no longer a priority, and where feelings didn't need to be silenced to make room for reason. That late afternoon, the city was wrapped in a light breeze, and the sky displayed golden and bluish tones dancing over the ocean's horizon. Seattle, with its quiet charm and soft lights, offered a landscape that felt tailor-made for that moment. After another productive and peaceful day, they decided to extend their walk to the waterfront, a place they had only visited together a few times since her arrival. But that day, everything around them seemed in sync with what they were living inside. Their steps aligned with natural ease, and without saying a word, their hands found each other and intertwined. There was no surprise, no hesitation. Just the quiet fit of two paths that, after so many twists and turns, were finally moving in the same direction. They walked for minutes that felt like hours, letting the sound of the waves and the stillness of their thoughts fill the space around them. Their movements were slow but steady, as if each step carried not only the present, but all they had overcome to be there, together, whole, and at peace. The city throbbed around them with its usual energy, but for them, in that moment, the world seemed to slow down. They didn't need to explain anything to anyone, nor prove anything to each other. The simple fact that they were side by side, holding hands and looking out at the sea, was the answer that closed the entire story of their comings and goings. There were no more doubts, no more dilemmas. What once seemed impossible, reconciling love, work, and identity, now flowed naturally. Not because of magic, but by choice, because they had faced their fears, because they had respected their timing, because they had realized that love doesn't require perfection, but the courage to begin again. As the sun began to disappear behind the horizon line, casting golden reflections on the water, they were still there, walking calmly. And in that peaceful setting, without fanfare, the story that began with a storm in Aspen, with emotional distances and hard decisions, found its most sincere resolution. It wasn't about a perfect ending, but a true beginning, hand in hand, not just as a couple, but as partners in life. They moved forward with the certainty that the love between them no longer depended on circumstances or the past. At last, there was space to build something real, together, in the now, with time, presence, and reciprocity.